so much for coming out and for being patient while we get set up. So I'd like to introduce Manoj Mate. He is coming to us straight from the UCI. Before that, though, he was visiting at Harvard and UC Berkeley. He was at Whittier with a lot of people that I think all of us know, and is a troubling side of the times. But the good thing about coming from Whittier is that we know that Manoj is really accomplished and thoughtful about teaching students who might not come in with the same kinds of credentials or might be first generation. And so one of the things that really impresses me about Manoj, aside from his excellent scholarly contributions and being a good colleague, is that he actually walks the walk and really thinks about how to use education as a part of social justice. So without any further ado, Manoj will give us 20 minutes worth of excellent information, so you can just go by that clock back there, and then we'll open it up for question and answers.
Sounds great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Kim, for that kind introduction, and it's great to be here with all of you today here at your beautiful campus, Gonzaga University School of Law, and it's my first time in Spokane, and it's a beautiful city as well, so it's a real privilege to be here with you today. So I'm going to present based on a current paper called The WTO and Development Policy Space in India. And I'm excited to announce that this paper has been accepted for publication in the Yale Journal of International Law. And the paper explores the interaction of international trade law and the domestic policy context to get a sense of how domestic policy regimes impact how the WTO affects what I call development policy space. And by development policy space, I basically refer to the broader sense of the flexibility and autonomy that the WTO and the international trade law regime allows developing countries to pursue industrial policies and development policies that advance particular development goals. Now, existing scholarship in this area has focused on three main approaches to examining the impact of international trade law and the WTO on development policy space. These include factors such as legal flexibility, looking at the flexibility of the international trade law rules themselves and how much room they offer to countries. Second, there are institutional approaches out there that focus on how countries develop what's known as trade legal capacity, or the ability to effectively litigate and advocate development interests before the WTO. And the third approach is the compliance-based approach, which basically focuses on whether or not countries are or are not complying with international trade law norms. And in my paper, I seek to go beyond each of these different accounts to argue for what I call a policy implementation-based approach to examining the WTO's impact on development policy space. And I was actually surprised as I looked at some of the literature at how little attention has been paid by scholars to how domestic policy regimes actually operate. And through my paper, I illustrate how domestic policy regimes play an important role in shaping the extent to which countries do have policy flexibility when it comes to the WTO and when it comes to international trade law. So in the paper, I examine and compare two really interesting case studies, or interesting if you're interested in international trade law. One is the US challenge to India's solar industrial policies in the India solar cells dispute. And the second is the US challenge to India in the India export-related measures dispute, which is a challenge to India's export subsidies programs. And in particular, I focus on one example of export subsidies, India's special economic zones policy. And as you can tell, both of these are challenges by the US government against India, and the US has been ratcheting up its protectionism under the Trump administration, first targeting on China, now shifting its attention to India, and has become quite aggressive in challenging India in many different ways. And the fear here is that this is leading to an emerging trade war between the US and India that could actually have detrimental consequences for both countries' relations, among other things. So in the paper, I argue that there's a difference in the policy space between these two areas. I argue that in the India solar cells case, there's arguably less policy autonomy or flexibility. And this has to do with the fact that the trade law rules dealing with local content requirements, which is what's been challenged in the India solar cells case. Local content requirements are basically policies where the government favors made in India solar cells versus foreign-made solar cells to try to help the Indian solar manufacturing industry. So the rules on international trade law dealing with these local content requirements are extremely strict. And in an earlier case, Canada Renewable Energy, the province of Ontario's local content requirements were struck down by the WTO. And the result was the same in the India solar cells dispute as well. So this is we see as a difference between the India solar cells dispute and the India export subsidies context. There, I argue, India actually has a little bit more policy flexibility or autonomy under international trade law. This is partly a result of the subsidies rules under international trade law being a lot more flexible. And it's actually really difficult to prove that a country is engaging in subsidies. But in addition, there are all sorts of exceptions for different types of subsidies. Subsidies basically refer to government's direct support for industrial policy. But beyond that, I suggest that the policy regime itself in India, the specific policy regimes governing export subsidies in India, also create more policy room and flexibility. So it's not just enough to focus on these legal rules. You have to understand how the policy regimes actually operate domestically. And the Indian policy regime itself does offer more room for maneuvering when it comes to exports, as I will illustrate later on. So what is the significance of this project? Well, part of this is that there's a broader concern that the WTO doesn't provide enough flexibility to developing countries. Right? As you're trying to expand these universal free trade norms, right? Tear down protectionist barriers, the idea is that free trade will lift all countries equally. But that's not the case. Right? Developing countries may need greater flexibility to catch up with developed countries. And what we've seen over the past 15 years is that many of the developed countries in the transition from the GATT regime, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, to the WTO, have basically made it more difficult for developing countries to do the exact same type of industrial policy tools that developed countries were using to get developed. And some refer to this as the kicking away the ladder effect here. So this is really important, right? This project and the broader concerns here about how trade affects developing countries is something we should care about here in the US, because if these countries don't have the room and flexibility and autonomy to operate, they may not be able to grow their economies, address poverty, job security, sustainability, all of these things that we want developing countries to care about. So this is really crucial. And second, there's a broader fear that if we keep enforcing these strict norms, that developing countries will ultimately opt out entirely of the international trade law regime. And that would be a really bad thing for the world if you believe that international trade law can uplift all nations through free trade. So I put this slide up here, right, to basically suggest that to some developing countries, they view these strict WTO rules, right, that prevent them from engaging in all sorts of industrial policies that could help grow their economies, sort of as a cliff, right? That if they're forced to comply with many of these rules, they will not be able to address things like poverty, inequality, job development, sustainability, things of that nature. All right? And in some ways, rather than jumping off the cliff, they'll turn around and they'll say, we don't want to be part of this international trade law regime. It's not helping us. Right? So there are broader implications of this project that I think we need to think about. So in setting up the paper, then I argue for what I call a policy implementation-based approach that focuses on specific policy regimes. So rather than just focusing on the WTO disputes themselves, the legal arguments, I suggest we should look at how the policy regimes actually work. And I was actually surprised that very few people have actually done this in the scholarship. And what I find is that there's three main factors that make a difference when it comes to how domestic policy regimes affect what's known as development policy space. And these are the policy goals, trade-offs, and available policy alternatives. That is, if one policy is struck down, what are other acceptable policy alternatives? Second, the nature and state of a particular industrial sector. Is it well developed and large? Is it too small to take advantage of particular policies? And third, policy transitions, the existence of broader national policy transitions in which the government itself is already fundamentally changing direction here. So now let's start with the first case study that I explore in the paper, which is the India solar cells case involving the US challenge to the use of India's local content requirements in solar industrial policy. This is a picture of one of the largest solar farms in India. It's actually either the second or third largest solar farm. These numbers keep changing because people keep building these solar farms globally. But as you can see, the scale of this is massive here. And in the India solar cells dispute, the US basically took on India's national solar mission, which was launched in the year 2010 by the previous government, the Congress government of Manmohan Singh in India. And the goals of the national solar mission were really twofold. The first was to dramatically expand solar energy generation capacity, install as much solar as you can on the ground. The second goal of the India's national solar mission was to dramatically ramp up domestic solar manufacturing capacity, help the industry grow and compete with other countries. But what happens here is the US challenges the use of these local content requirements, essentially these make in India or buy Indian solar requirements, that any solar power developer that participates in these national solar auctions. So just to give you a lens into the national solar mission, the way it works is the government will open up an auction and say, we want X amount of solar energy. Give us your best offer, right? Bid on these different projects. But in order to participate in the project, you must commit to use Indian-made solar cells and modules. This was struck down by the WTO at both the panel level, which is the lower level of the WTO, and the appellate body level as well, taking away a major policy tool that India was relying on to try to develop its nascent solar industry. This was a major setback for the Indian solar industry. And the reason the US brought the challenge was that an American solar maker called First Solar, which makes thin film solar, was going to be locked out of the Indian solar market. They went to the US government and said, this isn't a good thing for us, brought the pressure on, and this is why this happened. This, by the way, was brought under the Obama administration. So the WTO ultimately rules that these local content requirements violate non-discrimination norms. And I think this cartoon gives a pretty good image and sense of how people reacted to the WTO's decision. Right? This is a solar panel with the words "Made in India" on it, and the WTO basically crushing India's solar aspirations. And I think the cartoon really illustrates how developing countries react to the WTO. And you can notice there's a little sun there, and the sun is not happy at all, which is an important detail of this slide here. So again, I think this was a major setback for India. And what I do in the paper is I look at how India reacted to the decision. Because what I found is in existing scholarship, they haven't actually looked at how countries implement policies in response to these decisions. What are the policy alternatives and different options that countries can maneuver in? To me, that's a better measure of policy flexibility, and not much of the existing scholarship has looked at it. So I suggest India really followed a two-track strategy. One was a buy-time strategy. So during the course of the WTO dispute, India kept rolling out these local content requirements. The panel ruled against them. They still kept rolling them out. It wasn't until the appellate body finally reached its official decision that India finally said, okay, we'll come into compliance. But unfortunately, that buy-time strategy didn't buy enough time for the industry to grow. But the second strategy here is a policy implementation strategy. What are some other policies that India could pursue? And there's a number of these here. One is to expand the government's procurement of solar energy directly. So under international trade law, there's this interesting little exception to the prohibition on local content requirements that says that if the government is buying all of the energy, you can have local content requirements. So India now is having all of its state and local government sectors, even the Indian railways, they're starting to buy tons of solar here to get around the rules here, right? So it's an interesting approach. Unfortunately, the size of government is limited, right? So it caps the effectiveness of this policy alternative. They've also engaged in direct subsidies as an alternative. Now, interestingly, when the Modi government was elected in 2014, the BJP government was first elected, they were resistant to providing expanded subsidies. But something happened about 2 months ago that surprised everyone. The government did an about-face and have now announced billions, and I'm talking US billions of dollars, for solar subsidies for rooftop solar, farmland solar, and utility-scale solar. What changed between 2014 and now? It's election time in India. Right? The BJP government is running for re-election, and they have seen the light. Proverbial light, I guess, is one way to view it. Sorry about that. So suddenly, right, this could mean jobs for farmers, for all sorts of industries, right? So the political implications here, I suggest, my policy implementation argument here is reinforced by how electoral mandates can even shift policy flexibility. India has also imposed safeguards on Chinese solar imports and Malaysian solar imports. As I mentioned, India imports 85 to 90% of its solar from China and East Asia because they're able to produce it at such a low cost. And Indian companies aren't able to compete. So by imposing tariffs in the same way that the Trump administration has on China, they're hoping to try to equalize the playing field. And finally, we've seen the government announce linking auctions to manufacturing. And this is a really interesting idea. So instead of having local content requirements, the Indian government announced these new auctions that said, we will award you a contract if you agree to build an entire solar manufacturing plant facility next to the facility. Sounds like a great idea, a way to get around the WTO. One problem, no companies wanted to do it. The auction was delayed not twice, not thrice, but 6 times, and it has actually been a failure. So we can see how these policy alternatives have been difficult, right? It's been difficult for India to achieve those underlying goals of increasing manufacturing because of the WTO decision. And it's unclear whether or not the subsidies that are being announced right now will be enough to help them achieve those goals. By contrast, in the India export-related measures case, we see a different story. And the picture here refers to and highlights what's known as the Mahindra World City in Chennai and in Jaipur, which is an example of a special economic zone, which is one type of export subsidy challenged in the India export-related measures dispute. And what got caught up here is it actually says, do what makes you happy, which is sort of an odd thing to see for an ad for a special economic zone inviting corporations. But they're actually now trying to turn these zones into places where people live and work as well, these special economic zones. So the U.S. has challenged India's export subsidies, including the special economic zones policies, as violating the prohibition on export subsidies. Right? You're not allowed to subsidize your exports under international trade law. Now, interestingly, the subsidies regime actually has an exception for developing countries. If your GDP per capita is under $1,000, you can still use export subsidies. There's one problem. India just crossed that $1,000 GDP per capita mark in the last 2 years. And so it has now officially graduated. And I'm not making up that term. That's actually the official word used by the international trade law regime. It's called the graduation date when you pass out of the developing state into a developed state. But this number is illusory because India still is a developing country by many indicators based on poverty and other indicators. But the U.S. is arguing that it can no longer avail itself of this exemption. So this is an early case, and it's yet to be seen how the WTO will rule. But already the Indian government has actually been consulting and forming private corporate committees. So they appointed a committee led by a man named Baba Kalyani, who's the head of India's largest auto parts manufacturer, which is known as Bharat Forge Enterprises, to come up with a plan to bring this policy into compliance with international trade law, to get rid of the export subsidies. And they actually brought in PricewaterhouseCoopers to be the outside consultant on this. So it's this interesting mix of the government and the private sector working together to try to cooperate and get into compliance with the WTO. So the report, and I'll briefly summarize here, basically discusses a few recommendations. One is to rename special economic zones. India's special economic zones have been highly unsuccessful in achieving export, promotion, and other goals here. So I guess one idea is by renaming it, it will reinvigorate the plan. So they're now going to call them Employment Economic Enclaves, or EEEs. Second, there's a recommendation here to shift from export contingent subsidies to new incentives tied to employment and manufacturing. Third, there's a focus on improving India's infrastructure and industrial ecosystem. And fourth, new types of policies to promote manufacturing and services enclaves. So what's really interesting here is to compare the two. If we compare the two cases here, we see how these three factors help explain the differences in the policy space between the solar cells case and the export-related measures case, the special economic zones case. With regard to the solar case, I argue that India's, in terms of the policy goals and alternatives here, the local content requirements being taken away and struck down by the WTO has really hurt India's aspirations to develop domestic solar. And the policy alternatives that they're exploring are not likely to be successful. And this has to do in part with the fact that the industry is so small. Literature in this area shows that you need a certain critical mass of industry to benefit from a local content requirements policy. And unfortunately, we haven't seen a major policy transition until the last 2 months, right before election time. By contrast, there has been much more flexibility with regard to export subsidies and special economic zones. India has actually used, I argue in the paper, the WTO challenge as a window to sort of pivot its policies. These policies weren't working anyway, the special economic zones, so why not change while you're at it? So they're actually taking advantage of the WTO dispute and the new Modi government's policies, announcing a new industrial policy and what's known as the Make in India policies, taking advantage of the policy transitions in the area, as well as the fact that many of these industrial sectors are still small and are actually developing. So many of them are actually desiring some type of formal plan to address the special economic zones. So what I argue is actually because the domestic policy regime is more favorable here, right? Because the government is already on its way to a new industrial policy, they're basically taking advantage of the WTO and saying, we were probably going to do this anyway. And so therefore, India may be able to achieve those policy goals in a better way by actually coming into compliance with international trade law. But to understand that, we have to understand how these domestic regimes operate. Okay, so I think I'm at the end of my 20 minutes, so I wanted to take your questions and comments, so thank you again.
So I'm fascinated by your project because it's coming at this question about implementation and policy change from the point of view of the developing country. So I'm working on a project that looks at it in the other direction. What happens when you have a developed country that won't submit itself to international law, but you want to look at ways to implement international law at the policy level in domestic courts or in domestic, state, and local governments? Could your project work in a similar way? Could you basically reverse engineer what India is doing so that you could bring developed countries into line?
Yes, and it's actually interesting because my sort of next project as well focuses on a new WTO dispute because India now has filed a challenge, as you know, to the United States' solar policies, including here in the state of Washington. The Washington state's renewable energy policies involve subsidies and local content requirements. So India is now turning the tables on the U.S. But I think my answer to you is I think yes. I think we can use policy space based studies, right, and studies of domestic policy regimes to also account for how developed countries and state and local governments in the U.S. Can also have relative policy flexibility. So in the next paper that I'm working on, I actually compare how different U.S. states may have greater policy flexibility than other states. The argument I make is that the state of California, because of the scale and size of its subsidies and its economy, may have advantages over smaller states. And so what's interesting about the US and federalism here is that the local content requirements in some ways, I argue, are an equalizer for states smaller states in the US. And if we lose in that case, I think it could have disastrous consequences, particularly for smaller state economies. And it's something that I don't think a lot of people focusing on the case have really thought about much. We've been focused more on imposing tariffs on Chinese solar, and we're not really thinking about how this could affect us here. And it's already, Trump's tariffs on solar have already affected the solar industry by raising the cost and uncertainty of solar installers, because the US has relatively less solar manufacturers and more solar installation companies. So yes, I do think we could reverse engineer this and look at developed countries, even though they're not dealing with the same issues of development, because the dynamics of the policy regimes are still the same. So I hope that this argument can extend beyond developing countries.
Thank you. So I'm really curious about the graduating from.
I was shocked when I read about this as well.
Wonderful. But I'm really curious about this. $1,000 GDP is like the benchmark with the bright line, sort of with no like up or down. I mean, how is that set? When is it set? When is it reevaluated? What are the mechanisms for reevaluating? Are there exceptions to that? And how does that like impact? I mean, because it seems like a very arbitrary number.
Yeah, and this is, what's really interesting right now is the US under the Trump administration and some European countries have been pushing the envelope on this, whether India is developed or not developed, and other countries as well, in order to try to take away some of the benefits that developing countries do get under international trade law. So under the original GATT regime, there was something called special and differential treatment, or SDT, that developing countries got special benefits to help them catch up with developed countries. So some of these indicators, this $1,000 GDP per capita, really date back, they're outdated measures, right? And they may not actually be a reliable measure of what development means today. There's several different international financial and economic institutions, the World Bank and other groups that track a lot of these indicators here. And actually, it raises another interesting point. Sometimes the WTO defers to the World Bank and economic institutions instead of deferring to sort of human rights and other perspectives, right? And it suggests an uneven playing field. But this idea of graduation, that once you cross this threshold, you have to actually hit that threshold for 3 consecutive years, right? That's the magic rule, and India has just done it. But actually, if I could, I wanted to show why that is such a problematic indicator. So this is responsive to your question. I saved a slide. A bonus slide. So take a look at this, right? So you can look at the GNI per capita. So you'll notice India is now at 1,800 here. And look, compared to China, South Korea, and Singapore, right? It is much smaller, right? Just because it's crossed that threshold, look at the differences. But really take a look at some of these other indicators. The World Hunger Index, right? Poverty, undernourishment, and even the poverty numbers, I think, based on the measures they're using, may be undercounting poverty as well. The rural employment, right? If we look at some of these other indicators, it's not clear entirely, right? That top line number really tells you the full story of whether or not a country is developed or developing. So I agree with you. I think the formalistic nature of these thresholds doesn't correspond to the domestic realities here. And again, consistent with this domestic policy implementation approach, if you didn't look at these numbers and you just looked at the top line and say, wow, India is doing great. I mean, these numbers tell another story, and I actually think these may be undertelling the story as well. So it is, I think, very unfair to use that number to basically punish a country like India that is doing somewhat better than before. Its economy is growing, but given the scale of its population, it still faces important challenges. Yes.
Hey, thanks for your talk, Manoj. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My question was, or is, I hear hints of dependency theory in your talk. And I know this is an old theory that scholars used in the 50s and 60s to discuss the relationship between the West and the developing world. But I was wondering if at all you examined how these trade agreements might help exacerbate this dependency.
Yeah. And it was a.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. So I think there's no question, right? And if you look at current debates on international trade law, there are many scholars who do suggest that some of these international trade law agreements are structured very unfairly, right? In ways that do cultivate and foster dependency, and in some ways disadvantage the developing country, almost in a permanent state of disadvantage. So the idea of free trade, according to these scholars, is illusory because you're always going to be catching up the way the free trade agreements are structured. Right? In other words, if you're never allowing a country like India to develop its own manufacturing industries, right, its own self-sufficiency in these areas, it will be dependent on other countries, China, Malaysia, the US, for certain raw inputs or certain goods. In fact, India tried to make a similar argument to this in the India solar cells case at the WTO. They actually made an energy dependency argument, saying that under Article 20 of the GATT, which is called the chapeau, under which you can take account of certain exceptional variables here, India basically said, we are so dependent on China when it comes to solar that this really is both a energy security and national security risk because we're dependent on another country for our energy. And you can think about the US being dependent, right, on the Middle East for oil and other contexts as well. But I do think it is important to highlight that while international trade law can have benefits, I agree with you that I think it also can reinforce disadvantages that developing countries face. They're already at a table, playing at a card table or playing at in a frame where they're already at a major disadvantage. So yeah, that I think I would agree with you and sort of the ideas of dependency theorists that some of these trade agreements can reinforce dependency. And arguably, if you go back to the earlier eras of colonization, right, and where you had the colonizing powers extracting resources from former colonies, some argue that this perpetuates a different form of control. Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious about the special economic zones, which are not called that anymore, but because they have them in China too, and I've lived in one, and you know, they have tax benefits in them. And I'm just curious why they don't work, or why they didn't work in India. I don't know if they work in China or not, but I was just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, so China has really been the model here for the success of special economic zones. Through the use of these zones and the sort of hybrid mode of capitalism, the state capitalism that they've used, they've been remarkably successful in terms of increasing exports. And they've remade some of these cities, right, into these global export powerhouses. India has faced really significant challenges, and I can speak to why. India actually launched its first export processing zone. So there was actually a first title, EPZs, before SEZs, before EEEs in India. And part of the problem is that the state infrastructure, so in terms of roads, electricity, linkages, that type of thing, have been really lacking in India. And so that's one major problem that India has faced. Even the new Special Economic Zones Act of 2005, which sought to reform everything, still has not addressed some of these crucial concerns. Again, roads are in disrepair, ports are not functioning, electricity is intermittent. I should highlight one other facet that I wanted to address in my talk, which is these special economic zones themselves are very controversial in India. So one side of the story is these can be engines of growth. But in order to create these zones, the government is basically making it easier to take land away from poor farmers, from tribal groups in India. And so there is a human rights dimension to this that I haven't fully captured in the paper, but I wanted to acknowledge here in the talk, and I may in the final draft address this more. And I think it's important to note. So when we talk about development, right, and the use of these special economic zones to advance development, I think we're talking about one type of development. And we could be hurting other forms of development. And in India, this is a major tension that I've studied in other contexts as well. China has similar challenges when it comes to...
Although the government just says, I don't care.
Well, and so... and that actually probably is one of the major differences between China and India. The Indian system is relatively decentralized, fragmented, high levels of corruption, and so the power of the state is much weaker in terms of enforcement. And I think things can move much faster in the Chinese state economy as well. But there are some in India who want India to look more like China so India can catch up. There are others who have concerns about what does that mean for India's respect for its natural resources, its indigenous communities, human rights, and things like that. So there are interesting tensions. I think development, if we talk about development, it's a much broader concept. But it's interesting that you did live in China in one of the zones. I'd love to talk to you more about that experience.
So can you tell us a little bit about the benefits of staying within the WTO and leaving, and what keeps them in that balance, and what the tipping points might be?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think even the United States now is also in that place, right? We're already seeing President Trump blocking appointments to the WTO. The WTO is actually understaffed right now. There aren't enough judges, and it's slowing down the process. And if things continue, it may actually screech to a halt. So Trump has done a number of things to try to undermine the WTO, although recently, it's interesting to know the WTO started ruling favorably for the U.S., and one wonders if it's sort of like court packing and the switch in time that changed 9 when we talked about the U.S., that the threat of the U.S. has actually led to changes in judicial behavior here. But with respect to the incentives for why India would want to stay in the WTO, I think both China, India, Brazil, other developing countries, or now quickly becoming developed countries, have actually benefited in some ways from being a member of the WTO. So as I mentioned, in the early years of the GATT regime, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and the special and differential treatment that was given to developing countries actually got preferences in countries like the US for their goods, zero tariffs, and certain types of preferences to help developing countries in terms of their exports to the US. Now, it may or may not surprise you that Donald Trump recently announced in just the past year that the US will be suspending the Generalized System of Preferences, the GSP program, for Indian goods, taking away that preference for India recently. And so now India is trying to push back on that. But again, this actually signals this much larger fight between developed and developing countries. Developed countries do not want developing countries to be able to keep using that label to keep getting preferences here. Developing countries are saying, hey, we've got 1.2 billion people, and we've got to feed people, right? We have to provide employment. We're not there just yet. But in terms of the other incentives, other than the special preferences that were given to developing countries, India is a major exporter to the US, to the EU, to Asia, and it has benefited from the lowering of tariffs under both the GATT and the WTO. So it has made it easier for certain sectors in India, particularly the information technology sector, which India has, the sector has grown quite a bit, has taken advantage of the liberalized trade. So in certain sectors, it does benefit. In other areas, though, I suggest these policies can hold back, particularly when you're trying to develop new industries like solar and renewable energy.
We're almost out of time, but can I just ask one more?
Oh, sure, of course.
So usually when people are talking policy, they're also looking at norms and institutional theory. Have you thought about institutional change theory, maybe from like Bellin and other scholars out there? And I think, not Catherine Sipik, but she does work on social norms and implementing international human rights law in developing countries.
So, and I actually thank you for the suggestion and question, because I think institutional explanations and institutional norms may be an important driver of a lot of these things. And I think both Thielen's work, as well as I think Keck and Sikink have done work on different types of norms and how they drive things. And so I think one area that I could push this project further is to go beyond sort of the formal policy realm, to look at some of these other different types of normative structures that exist, both in the private sector as well as in the government sector. In some of my other research and scholarships, I've also done work on the Supreme Court of India and in a current project I'm working on, which is hopefully going to turn into a book project very soon. It basically argues for what I call an elite institutional account of judicial assertiveness in India, where I suggest that it's not enough to look at law and legal institutions to explain why judges become so activist. The Indian Supreme Court, and I won't bore you with the details entirely, is one of the most activist courts in the world.
So that's why I was thinking about this, is one of my friends in India working on sex trafficking and work on cutting down on sexual assaults generally. She said that India is really good about development in economic arenas and conforming with the international community and moving things very quickly in terms of adopting a lot of international economic norms, like the sustainable development, all the things issued from, say, like the UN bodies. She said they're very good, but then when it comes to norms that center more around human rights vis-a-vis human rights, it starts to get a little shakier. And it seemed like you were sort of hinting at that when you said that there's some people that are like, I don't know if we really want to be China, does that take away from who we are? And it seems like your piece, the one that you're presenting now, is sort of neutral as to that point. So it's helpful to hear that your other work is doing that and that you're moving forward with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what's interesting, the Indian Supreme Court is such an interesting institution because it is progressive in some ways and very conservative in other ways. For example, in the area of LGBTQ rights, the Supreme Court of India earlier on had reversed a lower court decision and basically upheld Section 377, which was a ban on sodomy, which was a colonial era law, and the enforcement of that law. Actually, just recently in the past year, they've reversed themselves and have now struck down that law. It was a major victory for LGBTQ rights in India. But I suggest that in my broader project research agenda, looking at not just legal traditions and norms, but actually the judges' own elite identities and the professional and intellectual communities that they're a part of can tell us a lot about judging. Because it's not as simple as liberal and conservative in the US Supreme Court in India. The Indian Supreme Court, if you didn't know it, appoints itself. The Chief Justice of India has the final say when it comes to appointments to the Supreme Court. And the court actually asserted that power in 1993 in a Supreme Court decision, reinterpreting the consultation requirement. So they basically said consultation means concurrent, and so the Chief Justice and Senior Justice actually have the final say. So I basically suggest that that reinforces a certain set of norms that are different from liberal conservative norms. And I think this, this project doesn't dive that deeply here because of the nature of the project. But I do agree with you that if we look at sort of these other elite norms, right, both professional norms, the norms that human rights NGOs have, we can learn how these different professional communities interact in the landscape of Indian law and litigation. And it's really fascinating stuff. So I do look forward to continuing that work as well. And I hopefully will have a chance to sort of link this research agenda with that other research agenda as well.
Well, thank you so much.